Mills, when Gothenburg, Nebraska became the center of the universe. When Gothenburg, Nebraska became the center of the universe. Brian Mills.
Good morning. When I was 21 years old, one of my best friends died. It was a shock. It was a tragic death. He was such a fun-loving guy who smiled all the time. He was a true light. So I wanted to find a way to honor his life. I decided to take a really long bike ride. I wanted to go from Wisconsin, where my dad's from, all the way to California. So I packed up my bags, packed up my bike, and flew all the way to Janesville, Wisconsin. When I got there, I felt terribly ill. I was sick for 2 weeks. I just sat inside and watched as the sunny days of the early spring passed by. It was quite frustrating, but then one day I felt a little better and decided to hit the road. As I said my goodbyes, I rode away from my grandparents' house, and the skies were clear and I was feeling good. But 1 mile in, it started pouring rain. Much harder than it does here in San Diego. Big raindrops. And I just looked up, laughed, and thought to myself, God, I know you're telling me that this trip is going to be tough. So I powered through, and that day was the toughest day of the entire journey. But all the days after that steadily got easier, and I had great interactions with people along the way. I rode through the trails of western Wisconsin and hit some country highways, met great people. And then as I started moving into the rolling hills of Iowa and then onto the straightaways of Nebraska, everything started to look the same. It got real monotonous. The days started blending together. And so then my mind started to work a little harder to come up with things to entertain myself. And so I started to think about all these things I wanted to do with my life as when I got back to San Diego. Ideas I wanted to share with my friends and family, and plans I wanted to enact in my life back home. And as I started to think like this, I wanted to be back home. I wanted to do all these things and share all these ideas. And so the trip started turning into just getting from point A to point B. And I was just so focused on the destination. And then one night I was sitting in my tent and I realized the error in my ways. I'm not going to be home for a long time. I had a ways to go. So I might as well be here, smell the roses. So I woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of presence and understanding of where I was. I threw on some tunes for the first time on the trip, some Bob Marley. My hair stood on end. I started zooming down, flowing down the straightaway, going silo to silo, water tower to water tower, and I just felt so present. I pulled into Gothenburg, Nebraska at the end of that day. And at first glance, there's not much to it. And there was only 2 restaurants there open for dinner, McDonald's and Lisa's Kitchen. Lisa's my mom's name, so the choice was obvious. When I got in there, I realized Lisa wasn't like my mom at all. She was a little old Asian lady who was running the entire show. She was the hostess, the waitress, the chef, and the dishwasher. And so I sat down, placed my order, and realized there was another person in the restaurant a couple booths away, a Catholic priest. After I ordered, he waved me over, invited me to join him for dinner. We talked and shared great stories, and turns out his name was Father Tim, and that is my dad's name. And so I'm sitting there in this restaurant and realizing, wow, like I'm 1,000 miles away from home. And here I am in my mother's kitchen eating with my dad, and he ended up paying for my meal. And the way I grew up, I never knew a home with both my parents in it. But in Gothenburg, Nebraska, I did. And I realized something there, that no matter where you are, if you give your all to the moment, you are home. So that night I found a nice campsite and had a great night's sleep. Woke up the next morning, went to the only breakfast place they had, and there was 2 round tables in there full of old people. One for the ladies, one for the guys. They were doing their little gossip scene and having fun. They asked me some questions and I shared with them my story. And I sat down at a booth, and along the wall next to me were all these Post-its. And on the Post-its were people's names and where they were from. And right next to my eye was a Post-it that said Janesville, Wisconsin. That's where I started. So I left that place feeling high. I was feeling so good. And so I started riding, and I hit an interesting stretch in Nebraska where there were some rolling hills. And I got to the top of this one hill and stopped, get some water. And I looked up, and there was one of those signs that says where the next towns are and how far away they were. Top of the list, Bruno, Nebraska. Bruno was my friend's name. Thank you.
Wow.